Well, I'm back again to talk about the Penguin after a stellar fourth episode. Before I get started though, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone who watched my previous video on the Penguin, which has been one of my highest performing videos on this channel to date. I'm incredibly grateful to all who've tuned in for that, and for all who subscribed from that video as well. So thank you. Right, on to the Penguin episode 4, and why this was yet again another brilliant episode. As I touched upon in my last video, a big element of what makes this show so compelling is its depth. The first 3 episodes do a great job at exploring each of the 3 primary characters in this show, that being Oz, Vic, and Sofia, but the narrative is always playing a balancing act between the 3 of them, with Oz taking central focus, given that it is his show after all. However, the first 3 episodes clearly alluded to there being way more to Sofia Falcone's history, so the creatives behind this show made the very clever decision to basically dedicate an entire episode to her backstory. This was a smart move because it gave them the time they needed to tell this story properly, which was absolutely needed. Over the countless video essays and behind-the-scenes footage I've seen for movies and shows, one of the first and most repeatedly told lessons I've come across is the principle of show, don't tell. In other words, a story is more compelling and engaging being shown to the audience rather than simply being relayed to us via character dialogue, because in showing a story to an audience, they get to feel and experience what that character is feeling and experiencing for the first time alongside that character in real time, which is a better way of cultivating a connection between the character and the audience. Now that's exactly what this episode of The Penguin does, and it does it particularly cleverly, firstly because of the way that it's set up. In the first 3 episodes of The Penguin, we are drip-fed information about Sofia via other characters. This kind of dialogue is referred to most commonly as exposition, because it acts as a way of providing background information about Sofia to the viewer. However, in this particular instance, it also does something particularly clever. It relays to us the public perception of Sofia, rather than the truth about what happened to her. So, it builds up an image of her in the viewer's head of what we can expect from the character. It's part of what makes her so intimidating and threatening, alongside Kristen Miliotti's brilliant performance, of course. Our first real glimpse of things not being how they are first told to us comes at the tail end of episode 3, where we get to see a slightly softer, more emotional side from Sofia when Oz opens up to her and she reveals that she's not the hangman.
You ratted me out.
I ain't no rat.
And I'm not the hangman. You see the way people look at me, right? Well, I know you do.
The context of that scene more broadly, coupled with the delivery of the line, made me and probably many other people believe her then, beginning to leave the audience with more questions than answers. This moment then acts as the setup for the next chapter in the story, as does the next thing that happens, that being Oz's betrayal of her. I was initially confused when watching episode 3 for the first time as to why they cut away from Oz and Sofia in the moment that they're held at gunpoint by the Maronis. I guessed that it was because the narrative focus of episode 3 was on Vic, and after coming to that conclusion, I didn't think any more on it. But after seeing how episode 4 opens, it makes total sense to me. Oz's betrayal of Sofia in this moment is the perfect thematic link to the overarching theme of that episode and Sofia's history. I like how the camera frames that sequence, really ensuring that Oz's abandonment of her is in focus, with the shots of him looking at her and her looking at him in desperation. With the added context that the opening of episode 4 provides, we can see that Oz could have rescued her too, if he wanted to. But obviously, he doesn't now want to rescue her, given that she knows he's been playing her and that he killed Alberto. Having the shots focus on this really emphasizes how much of a betrayal this is to her. He left her for dead, much like how many years before her father did. This opening, then, acts as the perfect entry point into the flashback sequences which make up the majority of this episode. We now know that the theme is betrayal, and now we get to see how she was originally betrayed to begin with. Whilst the whole episode was indeed strong, for me the standout section is the whole middle part set in the past, and the level of detail that goes into every element of the production is really on full show here. The first flashback scene, where Sofia is giving a speech, is a brilliant way of transporting us back to who she used to be. The lighting change is substantial. We go from bleak, moody lighting of Gotham that we've become so accustomed to throughout the show, to a much brighter and warmer environment. Sofia herself is shown to be different. Kristen Milioti performs her as much more normal. Lacking some of the smaller mannerisms she'll later come to give to her performance of Sofia after what that character goes through. The hair and makeup, too, is notably different. The camera, too, is very steady throughout the scene, so everything feels very stable and comfortable. And this is important to mention because of the contrast that will later be created as this story goes on. These opening moments of the flashback do a very good job of establishing who Sofia was originally. It also establishes the original dynamic between Sofia and Oz, which was an element of the episode that I thought was very interesting indeed. At first, she seems to appreciate him, even defending him against her brother Alberto's mocking of him. But as things get worse for her, we ultimately find out that she has no respect for Oz, and this acts as a brilliant way of showing us Oz's past as well. That's an element of this show's plot that I really like. The fact that her and Oz's history is intertwined, because it enables, even in an episode about Sofia, for us to still have a connection with Oz, and if anything, create a further bit of sympathy for him. We root for Oz because he's the underdog, and whilst he still is to some degree in the present day events of the show, it's less so than it was in the days of him being Sofia's driver. So in seeing these moments, it helps further flesh out why Oz is so power hungry in the overarching plot of this show. But back to Sofia. The scenes with her father, Carmine Falcone, were some really brilliant moments of this episode. Carmine in this show has been recast from John Turturro in The Batman to now Mark Strong. This was apparently due to a scheduling conflict, although I think part of the reason they're able to get away with it as well as they do is because of the fact that this episode is set 10 years or so prior to the events of The Batman, and Mark Strong does a good job mirroring the work of John Turturro to ensure the character feels essentially the same. It's also the third time that Mark Strong has played a character in a DC story, having played Sinestro in Green Lantern, Dr. Sivana in the first Shazam film, and now Carmine Falcone. So clearly this man loves DC. The scene where Carmine realizes that Sofia knows he's behind the women's deaths, as well as her own mother's, is fantastic, as you can feel the tension building. I also think more broadly this is actually foreshadowed in The Batman, given that when Carmine goes to kill Selina Kyle, he does so via trying to strangle her. So even from that film, this detail is set up and is a great way of tying together the film and show, which whilst I'm on that subject, I'll briefly mention I appreciated the cameo from Kenzie when he arrests Sofia. This makes total sense given how in The Batman, we're shown how Kenzie is one of the corrupt cops who works for the Falcones. His inclusion is a small detail, but one that as a fan I really appreciate, as it helps further build the connective tissue between this show and that film. The whole sequence from her arrest onwards is particularly brilliant at provoking shock and sympathy from the audience. Everything happens so quickly, from her arrest to her practically immediate incarceration into Arkham Asylum. From the inside the episode for this week's episode, it was revealed that these scenes relied much more heavily on handheld camera operation when they were shot, meaning that these shots become less stable, therefore adding to the sense of chaos of these scenes. Again, a small production design detail, but one that enhances the overall effect that these scenes are aiming to create within the viewer. Likewise, in terms of filming techniques, during the sequences where she undergoes electroshock therapy treatment, they were careful not to repeat the same camera angles more than a couple of times. The reason for this is again to create a sense of confusion and disorientation for the viewer, mimicking Sofia's descent into madness. That's something so interesting about the whole sequences of her at Arkham. It's interesting to see what happens when you place a sane character in a place of insanity. In terms of Batman media, this actually reminded me a little bit of the video game Batman Arkham Asylum. In that game, the premise is that Batman gets locked into the asylum with all of his greatest enemies after a mass breakout. As the game progresses, we get moments where Batman's own sanity starts to crumble. Induced via Scarecrow's fear toxin, the player gets to experience moments where Batman entirely starts to lose grip on reality. There's even one very clever moment where the game tricks the player into thinking that their console is breaking. The reason why I'm mentioning this is not just because it's Batman related, but because it covers the same idea. That being that if you're surrounded by madness, there's a risk of becoming mad oneself. There's a degree to which you have to survive the environment that you're placed in. The early seasons of Game of Thrones explore this not from the perspective of madness, but from the perspective of corruption and morality, or immorality. Ned Stark is incorruptible, and in a hyper-corrupt Westeros, where people are driven by a lust for power, it's impossible for him to survive without becoming more like them, because he won't become like them, because he truly is an honourable man and a force for good. He loses his life, because he refuses to change or adapt, and therefore he cannot win the Game of Thrones. Bringing all of this back to Sofia, at first, her time in Arkham is something that she only has to survive for 6 months, and that gives her the strength not to change, not to let go into hysteria too much, because to her, it's a question of time before she gets out. When Alberto comes to tell her that her trial has been denied and that she's stuck in there, we see that shift in her. It's the moment of true change. Earlier, before her incarceration, we see her begging desperately for her lawyers and her brother to do something to save her. But now, after those 6 months in Arkham, and the ultimate reveal for her that she won't be getting out, we see her break. This time, she doesn't desperately beg for help. In fact, this time, it's more Alberto who's desperately trying to find a way to help her. But she walks off, and what do we see her do? We see her give in to the madness of the environment around her. We see her kill Magpie. Again, in consulting the Inside the Episode, I thought it was fascinating to learn that they made the deliberate choice in this moment to focus the camera onto Sofia rather than onto what's happening to Magpie. The reason why this is the case is because it focuses the attention onto Sofia's reactions and behavior, clearly making a visual connection between her and her newfound violent actions, which acts as a reversal of the scene earlier in the episode where the doctors try to get Sofia to kill one of the other patients, only for that patient to kill themselves, with Sofia disconnected from that event. These two scenes in parallel act as a way of showcasing how her time in Arkham changes her. She doesn't start out as mad or as the ruthless killer her father makes her out to be, but ultimately, with her being in there long enough, that's who she turns into. She's changed by that environment, and through those scenes, we see the gradual progression of who she was into who she is now. It's brilliantly written, performed, shot, edited, and scored, and it's a really fantastic piece of storytelling, showcasing how, to use Sofia's own words, how someone can unravel. This then leads me on to the last section of this episode, the dinner sequence with the Falcone family and all that follows it. Circling back to my point about hair and makeup for Sofia from earlier, this acts as the biggest moment of transformation. Gone now is the neat hair and the regular makeup. Instead, we have crazier hair and far more distinctive makeup, which is referred to by the show's makeup artists as designed almost as if it was war paint for her. Likewise, we have the distinct yellow dress, clearly chosen by both the character in universe and the costume department as a deliberately bold statement. The monologue she delivers here is brilliantly done, and it acts as a clever way of her taking back some of the power from the Falcone family by controlling them in that scene. It also acts as a cathartic scene for her, with her getting the opportunity to get back at them over their betrayal of her. And also, it acts as a clever strategy from her, as this announcement of her departure to Italy fools them into thinking that she won't be a threat. The scene that follows, where she runs off with Carla's daughter, genuinely felt eerie to watch upon first viewing. It's deliberately written to make you think that she might do something to harm the daughter, to destroy Carla for her betrayal.
I'm gonna make sure that you never have to fight any monsters. Okay?
And the only reason it works is because how good this show's writing is. It's plausible to believe that Sofia could basically do anything. That's how unpredictable she is. And you know that the show's rating means that it can get away with a lot. So this moment is brilliant as it builds tension and then ultimately subverts expectations in the fact that she ultimately saves the daughter and kills the rest of them. It's a very good scene, and much like in the same way Oz's genuine care for Vic helps make Oz more likable and feel more human, Sofia, in this moment, in looking out for the girl, is shown to have some humanity and decency left within her, so it likewise makes her more likable as a character. Her method of wiping out the whole family is clever, using the air conditioning to poison them, and which actually reminds me a bit of her time in Arkham, given it's the ventilation shaft of her cell through which she communicates with Magpie for the first time. It also puts her in a good strategic position in keeping Johnny Viti around, as with him having no other Falcone left to turn to, he'll have to work for her, and given his influence and position, Sophia will now have the whole of the Falcone crime gang underneath her. Overall, then, yet another brilliant episode of what's turned out to be an excellent show. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this video, especially those who kindly requested it in the comments of the last video. It's going to be difficult for me at the moment to cover this show in this depth each week for the next 4 weeks due to busyness in other areas of my life. However, I absolutely will come back to it, either doing a combined video on episodes 5 and 6 and then one on 7 and 8, or a longer overall video once this series has finished in a few weeks' time. But I will absolutely continue to cover it when I can, especially since I've seen such massive support for my previous video on it, and likewise the same goes for other videos I have planned for the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and for everyone who has and continues to support this channel, as I really do appreciate it. And stay tuned for more video essays, reviews, and breakdowns coming soon. Thank you.